Okay, so I have a new file here, saved as number 12 if you want to load it in, uh, if you have version 8.4 or higher. And before, in the previous section, I was just having trouble really getting the detail to come out within that same layer. The reason for that was because of the fractal I was using. The square pairs was not giving me nearly enough information in order to properly control what it is I was trying to control, the color with it, and also modify um, the diffusion in the bump. And we did see a little bit of bump in there, but for the rest of the values, it just wasn't showing up, wasn't really giving me the kind of look I wanted. So what I did was I switched that fractal over to the square stones, basically the same one we used to create the actual building layouts themselves. One of those that we used towards the end of the sequence of different noises. So using that really brought out a lot of detail and gave me a lot more control over everything. So it certainly looks a lot better. So if you want to take a look at the changes I made, you can look at the file. If you don't have access to the file, really what I did was removed those extra key points, changed the color combiner over to blend rather than using the other combination modes, and then just added in square stones to mix along with the replacing of that simple fractal, switching it to the square stones from the square pairs, and then clipped it out a little bit. So then it's working quite well, and everything looks much better. So I just closed out the material editor. I also want to note I did make just now a couple more changes to the diffusion to pull a few more things out. I also just went and increased the highlight amount of the intensity. I'm going to make it a little bit shinier of a surface so it's less plasticky. And also, if you want to adjust the highlight color to be more variable so that it's not a white and you want that to vary, you can extract that color and control it the same way we're controlling some of the other ones, or even setting up, obviously, something separated from using the exact same function for everything. Also, if you're going to be creating more of a metallic look, the color reflected light looks really nice. And we can also start, if you want to add some reflections overall throughout the surface. But what I want to show you right now is how we can mix together a texture map with the color production in order to make it look a little more realistic. Texture maps certainly have their uses depending on how they're used. We're going to notice some repeats of the texture map if we have it scaled too small. Because we're in a parametric mode, the texture map of a scale of 1 is going to be the total extent of the terrain, so we will need to reduce its size. So let's go ahead and in the function we can add a texture map node, and we're going to use a projected texture map. We're going to set the mapping mode to faces, and then we can load one in. Now I'm going to load in something from Sci-Fi Halls. It's the AsFX Sci-Fi Halls collection. If you have the collection, you can load in the XL Hall number 5. Also, I'm going to, if you're using version 8.5 and higher, there is a built-in gamma that works throughout the entire scene, controls everything. It also controls individual texture maps. So it will automatically adjust their gamma to match the gamma you have set up. If you want to override that, there's a little Y and you can override the gamma, set it to 1 to bring in the original gamma. So that's really up to you, depending on how it ends up looking. I'm going to start with the system gamma just to see how that's going to turn out. A lot of times it may need to be adjusted. So what I want to do is blend together the texture map, or modify the existing color with the texture map. I'm going to add in the combiner node, set it to blender, because we don't have to use the combiner node or the color combiner. We can use just a regular combiner or blender, and our input 0 is going to be that color we set up before, and then we're going to modify that with the texture map. So the texture map right now is going to be stretched to the entire length of the terrain, which is a little too large because we are in the parametric mode. So what we want to do is reduce our scale. Let's start with just using a value of 0.1 to really reduce that, and then we'll check and see how that's going to turn out. So we can either blend the two together just looking at the texture map, or we can modify subtracting colors. Setting up minimum and maximum with these settings can create some really interesting results. So if I set it to a minimum all the way, that might be a little too dark with the current gamma. Let's go ahead and see how that's going to turn out. So that's created a pretty dingy and dark surface. I like it. Might be a little bit too dark, and I think that possibly the cubic mapping mode is not going to work for this in the parametric mode because of that scaling we have on the vertical edges. We do have a lot of repeating. It does create almost a floor level, but it won't allow us to shrink the texture down very much. So what we could end up doing is kind of swapping this with another texture based on the altitude in order to also get rid of the transition between the vertical texture and what's showing up on the flat areas, because that transition just doesn't really work well. It's I think a little too smoothly going into it. So we can mix these together different ways. So we'll take a look at controlling the textures a little bit more and adding in some additional textures. Let's go back and adjust our blend. I think the minimum is a little too much. Let's go ahead and blend them instead and reduce the blend amount. So now we can make adjustments to this texture, and that blend will stay consistent for the moment until we decide maybe we only want textures in certain areas, which we could then connect that to any of the part of the function, or using external dependencies from the terrain. I also want to set up an interpolation type of bilinear just to smooth out the surface. If we get too close to the texture, we don't want it to be pixelated. So I'm going to go ahead and add in another texture map. Load one in. And I want to control a blend between these two. So adding in a combiner node, set to blender, set to the blend mode, and we're going to adjust the way this is scaled. So we need to pick which one is going to be on the steeper areas and which one's going to be on the flatter regions. I think I'm going to pick this other one to be for the steeper areas. So what I'm going to do is go to the Y scale and increase that to 1. Might need to go a little bit higher. 1 should be good because it'll extend to the full range. If you're not working with a seamless texture, you can change this over to the mirror for the tiling on both the X and Y, in order to make it seamless. But what we want to do is control these to have this first material only show up on the flatter areas, or the lower areas of slope, so we can switch it over to the flat vertical mode for the mapping. And we're going to control the blend by using slope. So we need to find where our slope is here, and just to access this connection lower within the graph or within the function, we can right click, add a constant, connectable constant number, and this is for version 7 and up users, possibly version 8 or 7.5. We can connect that connectable or the output there over to the slope. So now we can bring this down lower into the graph to make our connections that we want to have controlled by slope. So the white is going to be the flatter regions, and then the vertical areas are going to go down to -1, which is the control. So what we need to do is adjust and have a sharper cutoff. Go ahead and connect that to slope, clip the ratio, and then we're going to add in a filter. So let's go ahead and use the smooth map. And we can adjust our lower value in order to modify the clipping. If you need a much sharper cutoff, then you can use the smooth clip, or just clipping it if you want a harsh transition. So it depends on the type of transition you want. But we want the output range. We can actually set this to 0 to 1. I'll leave it at -1 just for the moment, so that the changes that are made are more obvious. And then before I close out the function or finish it up, I'll change that over to 0, because that's what we need, is a ratio of 0 to 1. So we can set this now to be, let's say, 0.9, which would be around 80%. Because keeping in mind that we are working from -1 to 1, and not just from 0 to 1 for, or from the slope. That does output the number from -1 to 1. So you can see just that top area of the sphere that's being used to preview the material. And then we'll go ahead and set that lower value to 0 to get the mapping we need. So let's see how well that works, and whether or not we need to fine-tune the slope. And I just need to actually go back, because I do have the inputs in the wrong positions. They are reversed. So I'm going to take input 0 and connect it to that second one that was loaded in, and just swap those out. You could also go to the map and change the lower value to 1 and the upper value to 0. That would have also swapped them automatically. So let's go ahead and take a look. And it does look broken up a lot better, although I don't believe it is really mixing enough with the fractal or the procedural color function. So I think what I'm going to end up doing is increasing that intensity, because that's just not blending enough. It's not modifying the color as much as I'd like it to. So we'll go to that blender, and we'll bump that up to 0.7. And if you want to add a little variation between which areas have a texture and which ones don't, you can connect this to any of the inputs, any of the different fractals, within the function, or also creating a new one if you don't want to use those areas. But I would like to have cutouts of maybe, say, specific buildings. So I'll select the external dependency to be the blender, clip that ratio, and then we're just going to create a variation on this with a filter. We're going to change this over to absolute. Set our contrast to 1, and then we can adjust the threshold. And maybe contrast to 2. And set our threshold to -0.9. So we'll go ahead and see how that's going to turn out. We might not have enough areas mixed, or we might need to invert that function. And I'm hardly seeing any of the texture. So we'll go back, and that absolute, I think I'm going to remove that or switch it with a smooth clip. So we also want it to be brighter in order to get more of a texture. And that should work out a little bit better. So I'll probably go ahead and increase the contrast again just a little bit. Also the texture map, it looks like I need to increase that slope amount because there's too much stretching overall. And it looks like the area that's supposed to be just on the vertical is blending too much with the flatter zones. So just a little fine tuning. Going to that smooth map on the slope and setting the lower value to 0.95, maybe 0.96. And then also setting the lower clip to 0 because our blender is just really going to cut it out. And it looks like not nearly enough is white, which is why we're not seeing that texture map. It was a little difficult to see with that lower clipping set to -1 because those light gray values were just blending in a little too much. So we'll set this contrast to 2.5, set the brightness to 2, and that should give us a little bit of a better blend. And we'll zoom out and take a look. And I think there are just a few too many lines within the flat surface texture. So I'm going to go ahead and just pick another texture for that. And also, another thing I could do is just use the other texture and rotate it, the same one, to give that same sort of coloration and look. But in order to have it cut off at the proper places. Another thing is if you don't want to have, or you always want to have a texture somewhat showing a lighter blend where you're not completely destroying or removing the texture from the scene, you do want to have a little bit always showing. You can take that one of the clipping values, and depending on the input, 0 being our color, and making sure that we never reach 0. So what we can do is take our lower clip on the smooth clip that's controlling that blender between the texture and the procedural color, and set that to equivalent of a percentage. So if we want to do 15%, we type 0.15. I'm also going to go over to that slope control and set that to 0.94 for the lower value. Maybe use something a little harsher 2. We could set that over to a smooth clip. So that's at our lower. We'll just leave lower at the moment, and just kind of adjust this. Brightness and contrast does make it a little hard, so let's just clip. Or we can actually, the best way to clip it is going to be the map, because then we have a direct control. So let's go ahead and type in 0.94. And if we need to increase contrast, we can do that within here. But I am going to select now the texture map. That first one I loaded in, I think it's got too many lines in some of the areas where it's showing. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it and see how that turns out. I'm also going to go to that other surface and override the gamma. So that left one, so it's a little bit lighter. Didn't really like the variation that was coming out of it. So we'll see. We might need to pull that down a little bit more, but we'll take a look. And as this is rendering, I can tell that I did have that original texture map set up correct, and that the altitude control is appearing a little bit differently. So if we have this one on 1, either that or my settings were not remembered. So 0 would be the lower value, 1 the upper. So input 1 is the darker. Let's go back, and I'm going to set my gamma 1.2, and that should hopefully take care of that. Okay, so it's looking better. I may go ahead and reduce the Y scale of the vertical texture and just see how it looks with a basically equal setting. Also, if you never want, or if you don't want to have the texture be 100% and always have a little bit of that color that was created from the color maps, we can reduce our clip the same way we did before. So we never reach a value of 1, which is fully texture. We can set that to 0.8, or let's say, let's actually go ahead and do 0.6. So that way we always have a good mix between the two. So I'm going to go to this other section here. And we might have to just square it out just because of the way that the textures are oriented in this mapping mode. And it might be kind of difficult to get that perfect, so we might have to do some more adjustments or use a different mapping mode. But just look better at the moment. So I think I'm pretty happy with that overall. Might end up adjusting maybe the gamma on the vertical wall texture. Maybe darkening that a little bit. But I like it for the most part. What I want to show you now is how we can take advantage of slope even more to create some really cool detailed materials to light this up in different ways, basically adding lights. If you're a version 5 user, you are going to have to do this within the same material function using the slope input. And what I'm going to be doing is using a layer. So if you're using version 6 and up, you can follow along with the exact way I'm doing this. But if you are using version 5, then you will have to go into the function and control the slope instead of using what's going to be the environment tab. So what I want to do is add a layer, and I'm just going to hit the X in order to just create a blank layer. We're going to edit the color map, and I'm going to set this up for the color of the lights I want. So sort of an orangish yellow. And then we're going to go to the environment tab. I'm going to make sure the altitude range is set all the way. What you're going to have is the ability to adjust the slope range. So if you are using version 5, you just control the alpha or controlling what we're going to do is the lume value. So you will need to control luminosity with the slope input within the node itself instead of being able to create the layer. So if we go to the slope range, what I want to do is I don't want to show up on the flat areas, which in this version of view, the slope range, we have flatter areas towards the right. Although if at any point in the future this happens to change where the lower or the flatter portions end up on the left, you can just reverse it in order to do that. Possibly at some point in the future if that does happen. But otherwise we're going to stick to the values on the right. What I'm going to do is enter in a value of 0.95, and for the low point, I'm going to have it at 0.94 and then 2. Now the 2 is going to disappear, but it will still remain in the function. If I go out of that environment tab, it's going to basically round the number down or up, and then that extra number disappears, but it is locked in, it is still inputted, you just can't see it. So this is going to control our slope. We don't want it on the super flat areas. What I want to do is create an outline around the edges where it starts to kind of slope in, and that's one of the biggest reasons why I didn't use a really sharp set of noises in order to create the geometry. Well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons. And then we're going to go to the luminosity, or the luminous value, and turn it up to, actually, let's go ahead and do 95, not fully 100. And we're going to see an interesting change. So now we can start to see strips of lights showing up throughout the terrain. Now, the speckled lights, or the dots of lights that are showing, are the reason for that is because of the minimum range that I'm using for the slope, and it's actually caused by a lack of geometry. If we were to zoom in, it would be a thinner strip, but because I'm using a lower quality rendering mode, it just show up as little dots without having to modify the alpha. So for a still, that might be something that works out pretty well. I'm going to extend the range and also bring it to more of the flatter zones because I do want to pick up more of the edges. Although if you did want to have multiple layers, you could set that up just by adding in another layer and modifying its slope. So let's go back. And if you don't want to lose the bump value, under bumps you can add instead of replacing. So maybe I'll smooth that out a little, but have a little variation. So we'll set it, just go ahead and 50. Even though there is no bump on this channel, we don't want to remove anything at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and set this up to 0.98 for the upper value and the lower value 0.9. Actually, let's use 0.965. Let's open it up a little bit more and try to extend the light area and thicken the strips. should start to look a little better, and we can start to adjust that as needed if we need to have more of a full coverage. So that did open it up a bit more. With this terrain, we do have a lot of curved areas, so we may have to go a little bit higher for that upper value, possibly even 9.5. We just don't want to go all the way up to 1. At least we shouldn't need to, although there is so much curvature it might end up being necessary. Really just depends on the slope level of the terrain. So let's go back 0.9, let's do 0.96, or 0.98, 9.95, let's try that. Okay, so 0.96 for the lower value, 0.995 for the upper value. It's not quite 1, just a little bit under. So definitely a lot more coverage now. And really, I mean, looking at this, there aren't many flat areas. So typically when I end up with terrain like this, using this technique, I do have a lot of flat zones. This one, I think I ended up using less contrast because I ended up liking the way the curvature looked with this setup. So you might be able to extend it up the slope range up to 1 and not be covering the entire flat areas. But at this point, I mean, it's really very fine-tuning, very small adjustments in order to cover up those edges. So we can also go through and add additional layers to cover different slope ranges. If we wanted to add some strip lights on the side, you could reduce that slope range a little bit more. But you can see it starts to get really interesting when we start adding these additional layers. And of course, you can add as many material layers as you want as a version 6. And then if you want to cut stuff out or place different colors and transitions into different materials, using the slope is a great way to do that. And this is a closer up render, so moving it much closer to the terrain, and we can see some really nice variations overall. Might want to have maybe a smaller scale texture or procedural to manage maybe the diffusion or the highlight. Also, the specular that I have right now, or the highlight variability, I think is too intense, and the overall value is too high. So I'm ended up with these very bright white areas that are maybe too much. If we add a bit of glow to the white areas, and you can use the lens glow or lens glare. If you double click on the camera, you can turn on lens glare. That works pretty good for it. Or in post, you can take care of that because it is, I mean, more realistic to have peaking areas like that with this type of surface. But what I want to do is go to that layer, I think, and reduce the brightness, maybe adjust the dull to shiny, and then the highlight intensity. I'm going to edit the filter and add a point over on the left side so that we never fall below a certain value. I also don't want to go beyond the global amount, so what we can do is set the upper clamping mode to clamp, and that way it'll never go beyond that value of 1. Going lower, not going to be a problem. So maybe we can, with that change, increase our overall brightness. And there's some different lighting situations we can use too. Let's go ahead and take a look and just see if that improves it a little bit better. And that definitely looks a lot better. And two adjustments I'd like to make to the material. It's going to the environment for, we're going to call this the lights layer, and taking that slope range, bringing it down to 0.95, maybe even ended up going a little bit lower. I'm going to take my alpha boost and hit a -5, so that way we'll be able to see somewhat of the detail underneath. That should work out pretty well. And I'm going to go ahead and rename that other layer the base layer. And go to the bumps, and right now the setting of 4 I think is too much, so I'm going to set it to 2, and that should look a lot better overall. So with the reduced bump and widening the lights layer, looking a little better, you can start to see somewhat of the transition by lowering that alpha as we did. Not by much, but that layer can be modified in different ways. And we can set up an alpha, or running an image or a noise or a fractal along the alpha for there to cut out some of those areas so that we don't have a completely smooth strip if that's not what you're looking for. You could also reduce to a lower range of the slope from 0 and up in order to affect some of the vertical areas. So a lot of different ways to continue forward with that. And I also want to note that that lights layer, because of the way it's based on slope, is going to be very much dependent on the height of the terrain. If I was to reduce the height, it's going to flatten everything out. So we're going to see the lights a lot more frequently because we have much more or much larger areas falling within that range. So as we can already see as it's starting to render, it's really taking up a lot more space, and we're getting a lot more lights. So that is one thing to keep in mind. I'll go ahead and let this finish up, and we can take a look at that finished reduced scale. So a lot more lume coverage with the light layer, so a lot more flatter areas, less variation, and really looking at it like this, you can tell that that bump that I added, which I think might be multiplying against the input, which is creating those squares everywhere, that is just way too intense. I believe I have it turned down really, really low, but it's just creating a very heavy modification on the material, or on the bump channel, which does not look good. It's a little too sloppy, a little too messy. And I really liked the original outlines of the buildings themselves, and it really kind of takes away from that. So I'll probably end up reducing that output, maybe blending it with 0, or blending it with a value of 1, or reducing the blender. Before, just because of the way it was set up and the intensity compared to the other intensity, even with a value of 0.005, it was showing up really intensely. So might just have to blend it together with a constant number. But it still gives you a good idea overall of what you can do with this kind of setup. I'm going to increase that height. It's maybe a little too flat. And then we're going to go ahead and in the next section just kind of pick up from here and continue along with creating the scene and taking a look at some more techniques.